Welcome all. We will wait patiently as people file efficiently and effectively into the virtual auditorium of this Transport Planning Society evening lecture. I believe we had almost 300 registered as being interested, and the law of these things is the law of the half. So one imagines that we should be somewhere above 100. So we'll just wait a few minutes as people join us before we kick off. For those of you who are with us already, just a little bit of housekeeping. Brogan's kicked off the session in the chat, so you'll see that start to materialize in some comments from panelists and from attendees. If you do want to ask questions to the panelists, then by all means use the chat function. We'll try and keep the debate in there rather than jumping between that and the Q&A. I've done a fair number of these for transport planners, and I've never seen everybody arrive on time, but I don't know whether that says about the transport planning industry, but to be expected. Okay, we'll wait for 50. How did I know that was going to be a particularly long wait? There we go. Excellent. Okay, so thank you all. Formal welcome now to the third of the Transport Planning Society's series of evening lectures. I'm Mark Frost. I'm the current chair of the Transport Planning Society, and I'll be looking after proceedings tonight, aided by my excellent panel I'll introduce shortly. A particular welcome to all of our paid up TPS members who are joining us this evening. Without your valuable support, we wouldn't be able to do events like this, or indeed any of our work. So, big thank you for you. For those that are joining us for the first time, just a little bit about the society. TPS was founded back in the heady days of 1997 as a home for transport planners, recognising that we represent a discipline that is distinct from both planning and engineering, which is where we've previously been lumped. We've been instrumental in developing a comprehensive professional development framework for transport professionals, and recently, for our partnership with the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport, had this recognised as a chartered qualification. So it's now possible to become a chartered transport planner, which has been a long time coming. We also make regular representations on policy matters on behalf of the profession to government. Even just last week, we were interviewed on the BBC around congestion and induced demand. Not often the BBC asks questions about induced demand, but it was great to be able to put the professional view on that, and also giving advice and evidence to various all-party parliamentary group investigations. So a busy society. And I think actually the topic for tonight's debate illustrates perfectly the breadth of skills necessary to be a modern transport planner, and that perhaps makes us a little bit distinct from some of those other professions that we occasionally get lumped with, in the sense that we are sometimes a custodian, sometimes a curator, and very often a referee of public space. And in order to discharge those duties successfully, it is necessary to reach out and engage with the public, not only because it's a statutory duty to do so, and if you don't, you'll end up in a judicial review situation, but ultimately because we need our products to be accepted and utilised by the population if they're to achieve their objectives. And we simply can't design those sorts of products in a silo. We have to, without bringing people along with us. And I think this particular topic is very timely, given the experience of the last 12 to 18 months of transport planning. And I think in terms of engaging with the public, it's been both transport planning's zenith and also our nadir. Zenith in that we were forced to engage with residents and the general population far more often and at a scale perhaps than we've ever done before, because of the changes that we had to make to the network. Nadir because we had to do that at a huge pace, and there was very little time to build consensus before changes happened on the ground, and that left many people angry and confused at what we were trying to achieve. At its more sedate end, that articulated itself in FOIs and petitions, and at the more extreme end, it was public protests, vandalism, discontent on the streets, and even death threats for practitioners. So it just goes to show the power of getting this stuff right. On the plus side, the humble bollard has brought many, many more people to this debate than probably have ever engaged with it previously. And I think the challenge, therefore, is in harnessing that energy in a positive way and doing what we can and using some of the techniques and tools and experience that my panelists will talk about this evening to pull people away from a position of conflict and distrust, which is where perhaps too many of the population are right now. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome a great panel of speakers who've done a huge amount of thinking on this issue, much more so than me. In terms of format, we'll use the first hour to run through all the presentations, and then we'll turn to a panel discussion and Q&A. If there are any questions, please do use the chat function. So the panelists will be engaging with the chat throughout the debate, and we'll use some of that to bring the themes together for the panel discussion at the end. There is a Q&A session there as well if you want, but it may be easier to keep things in the chat. And so without further ado, I will start the proceedings with Dan Phillips. Dan Phillips is a Senior Research Fellow in the Intelligent Mobility Design Centre at the Royal College of Arts, and he was involved in our Future Towns project last year, which was co-financed by the Transport Planning Society and featured in our Transport Planning Day campaign in 2020. Dan, without further ado, I will hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, good. So thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts this evening. As Mark said, I work at the Royal College of Arts as a Senior Research Fellow. And before I start, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the Intelligent Mobility Design Centre. So we're one of 5 research centres at the college, and the others include inclusive design, material research, robotics and computing. And we work with organisations around the world to develop collaborative research partnerships with human-centred design-led approaches at their heart. And I lead the People and Place studio within the centre, where we investigate the relationship between mobility, society and our environment, while my colleagues focus on design transformations in the automotive industry and also the impact of new technology on mobility. So in this talk, I'm going to tell you a little about our Future Towns project, which we developed in collaboration with transport and planning societies, as well as colleagues from industry and civil society. I'm going to reflect on some learnings that we gathered through a policy research activity earlier in the year, and end with some thoughts on behaviour change and the role of engagement in policy and in democratic movements. So we're facing multiple and overlapping environmental, public health and socio-economic challenges, and we're trying to solve them through traditional and technocratic approaches that have made planning an opaque, and dare we say this, a boring topic for many people who live and experience the consequences of planning in their everyday and future lives. So our Future Towns suggested that community placemaking and transport planning should be a creative and inclusive opportunity to involve everyone in imagining and developing our future communities, a way of engaging more deeply in community interests and values, and an important part of changing people's hearts and minds when we think about the future and our beliefs. So in this project, we developed a range of tools. So we developed listening tools that illustrated people's hopes and fears through possible utopias and dystopias, highlighting practical opportunities and challenges, as well as more creative ways of communicating our potential futures. We provided communities with tools to learn about the present and the future from different perspectives, from the value of making decisions together to the cost of inequality in our daily lives through health and education and crime, for example. And we developed visual ways of understanding our impact on the world, from the 16 million miles that a small town drives every year to the 50,000 trees that they would need to plant to offset their travel. While learning together will lead to a greater level of knowledge, shared concerns and mutual ambitions, we also wanted to develop ways to help communities to express their own creativity, to imagine their future rather than having a future imposed upon them. So we developed a range of ways to allow people to express themselves, building on community knowledge and interests, making tools more playful and creative, and even democratizing some of the technology that designers, engineers, and planners currently own and control. But while these approaches and tools suggest ways of engaging with communities, we don't know how they will give everyone an equal voice, or even how they might change the balance of decision-making within our many towns and villages. So we spent some time earlier this year listening to the views of community experts to find out a little more. As one of our participants told us, residents have answers to so much, but the engagements and consultations that we do are kind of, do we put this bridge here or here? When we ought to be asking deeper questions to get everyone to imagine the future. We've got all these policies and strategies, all the documents we could possibly ever want, but how do we share that knowledge? Might utopias and dystopias based on real concerns and aspirations get everyone to respond? Many participants wish for planning of places and transport to follow the principles of sustainable development, but they identified the need for more smaller scale interventions. For example, a place that impresses at a small scale with quirks and details, old pubs and misfits. Towns should smile. And while they appreciated the possibilities of this approach, they wanted to know how we might prioritize the voices of those who are excluded, make it simpler and cheaper, accessible offline as well as online, and be able to build on real projects where the reality and trade-offs come to light. Participants were particularly interested in understanding how this approach might support more reciprocal dialogue to make a patchwork vision from diverse perspectives and different needs that is future-facing and grounded in shared values. So governments are awash with strategies for future challenges, and the world of transport and placemaking is dominated by planning requirements, processes, surveys, and consultations. Our research suggests that the scale and speed of transition that is needed to meet the climate emergency, as well as the growing and unequal impacts of development on communities, will need to go far beyond traditional consultation, codification of physical development, and markets for land use, buildings, infrastructure, and transportation. We will have to open these questions and the answers out beyond the loudest voices and the richest purses, so that we can hear from young and old, those in need as well as those in places of power. We need to go beyond you said, we did, to we're making this together, join in. And before I finish, I wanted to briefly mention some of the theories around which we developed the project, as I think they can provide some useful insights into engagement, participation, and democracy too. So here are some theories. The first person I would like to mention is Donella Meadows, an American environmental scientist and educator who explained the importance of leverage points in a system, and in particular the fact that a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. As she says, it's not unique to systems analysis, it's embedded in legend. Christopher Ives, a sustainability scientist in Nottingham University, used system leverage to examine our ability to reconnect with nature for sustainability, simplifying the leverage points to the 5 key interventions that we used in our future towns, from philosophy, emotions, and knowledge to experience and material change. And another important element that we need to consider when we develop ways of supporting creative participation is the need to examine our mental models. And Dr. Dwayne Biggs from Namibia has used this idea to engage with conservation planning, breaking down the barriers between different stakeholders in order to find common ground. Finally, I'd also like to mention theories about group dynamics. The first, theorized by Professor Erica Chenoweth, is that a small group of active participants can transform the whole of society. Whether this can apply to the climate crisis and our sense of place and mobility is yet to be proven at scale. But if 3.5% of the population are unable to create change due to legal or other constraints, then perhaps we need to engage with the 25% rule. This shows that 25% of a group can persuade an undecided majority to go along with their preference, provided that they coordinate with each other. So the challenge for all of us is that changing hearts and minds is not simply about engagement, but about participation. And real participation can only happen when we approach our communities not with answers, but with questions, not just with information, but with knowledge, and not just with solutions, but imagination. Thank you very much. That's it. That's it from me, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. That was excellent. I've just popped a link there to the Our Future Towns project in the chat. And I mean, I really encourage people to have a look at some of the visuals that the project produced, which are really arresting and really help stop people in their tracks and work. Hang on a minute, there is something going on here, and sort of break their habit a little bit. The number of car miles that people in that small town drove was one of those. Okay, excellent. Straight on then to Elizabeth. Over to you. Elizabeth, you're on mute at the moment, but it gives me an opportunity to say that you are a transport planner from WSP, working in Leeds, with a long history in research and engagement. You'll be discussing community engagement forums that you've done in Calderdale Council.
That's right. And thank you so much. And I'm really pleased to be here and really excited to hear Dan's set of theory. I'm going to discuss, I guess, a case study of trying to use focus groups in particular in public consultation and trying to bring in some of that. How do we engage more honestly with people? And what benefits do we get from that in consultation? So setting the scene a little bit, I'm speaking particularly about a Transforming Cities Fund project. One of the things about TCF is that we're moving as fast as we can. And we desperately needed, I want to say data in, experience from people on the ground so that we could make the best designs that we can in a very formative stage. So I've got very high level plans to show people. And every day after a focus group, I can get some information in and we make little tweaks to what the more feasibility designs might look like based on lived experience. This was part of a consultation. 3 weeks, a month after a set of focus groups, there's also a broad online questionnaire, essentially a survey approach. I am always interested in hearing from the people from the edges. And I guess one of the things I would say is that if we can design for a parent with a pushchair and a child of 6 as well, to navigate through their streets, use their neighborhood happily, get to and from school and make a work run, we've made a design that works for quite a lot of people. But one of the themes about anyone who we talk about as seldom heard, this parent of 2 young children, they are not rich in time, and they may not be rich in money or the money that liberates time. So in asking for their time, we're asking for quite a lot from them. And we sometimes talk about people being hard to reach. Some of those are barriers that we can look at and address. Some of them are, do people want to give us their time? Do they trust the relationship? Questions like that. A quick example for this of a barrier that I can fix. I know that I'm interested in one particular neighborhood that is opposite a mosque. It will definitely have a Muslim population predominantly. It's springtime. Sunset in the UK changes drastically week on week, the sunset time, and therefore prayer times, the final prayer times at the mosque, changes week by week. Slotting in just the time of a focus group to account for the working day and prayer times is my responsibility. That doesn't make somebody hard to reach. And in terms of, these were focus groups we put together. This was not a public, there's a date, sign up, come to it. There was active outreach to reach as many people across different groups as we could, but people who tended to be seldom heard, quieter. There were 2 groups that were specifically for young people, one 16-year-olds in schools, one, let's say, 16 to 22 age, supported by a Muslim charity. And even within those seldom heard groups, seldom heard people, I made a divide of quieter voices and even quieter voices. So board members of the mosque were community leaders. People who came to pray at the mosque and to use its services were quieter voices. Staff members at a charity were community leaders. Families who used the charity came to quieter voices because we felt facilitation would be different for those two groups. And when I'm structuring that conversation, there was myself facilitating. I had fantastic input from Calderdale Council and people, someone who can help people engage with their council, what's available for them, what's going on. A note taker, we used a Miro board, and I did ask someone to specifically navigate that for us so I could facilitate and they could screen share and move things around. And when I'm setting focus groups, I've listed kind of 5 things I think are especially important. For this, setting expectations was very high. Nothing's going to be built for 2 years. I don't want people to go away feeling like I've given this input and nothing happened. And also, what can we actually do? TCF comes with funding and what it can be spent on, funding objectives. Fantastic focus group participant brought forward an idea that they have kicked around this neighborhood from SRB days, single regeneration budget that puts it at the late 1990s. Can we just purchase a row of terraced houses, flatten them, and have enough parking for the neighborhood? And no, it would be dishonest of me to write down, oh, that's a really interesting idea. I will take that away. No, the thinking has moved on from that. I can hear how incredibly important parking feels in this neighborhood and for what a long time it's been important. I can tell you the knocking down terraced houses isn't going to happen. And also as part of a responsibility, I can challenge that need a bit. I've got 10 years to solve drastic climate change. We all have. Are there other concerns in the area? Are there concerns that are differently important than parking is? What about health? What about breathing issues? I know those exist, but it makes the problem-solving joint between us rather than me just saying no. And the great thing about focus groups is the opportunity to test agreement and disagreement, to understand why somebody sets something forward, and to understand what the minority opinions might be as well. We showed people this. I understand that you can't see much in detail. I can't see much in detail. So the Miro board had lots of little zone plans around a central map. Those zone plans looked more like this, and you might be able to see a little bit more. We had a key, and this is the plan that we presented to people. And then we gave them the opportunity of which neighborhood they wanted to discuss. There would be room for 3 or 4 probably in an hour session. And then if they talked about this street, we'd put a sticky note down here. When I did the analysis, then the colors told me what kind of organization or person from an organization had made this comment, and the geography of exactly where they're talking about. The different groups gave different responses. So you'll see this is the same neighborhood, different evening. It looks like this. The responses from the community leaders were incredibly balanced. The responses from community residents were slightly desperate, fix this problem. And the youth groups saw different problems than some of the more residents who have older relatives they're trying to take to appointments, for instance. Things we learned that we didn't know when we went in and might not have learned if we hadn't been having fairly careful conversations. This housing here as I say, is directly opposite a mosque. Very tight terraced housing, no drives, multi-generational households, often 2 or more cars per household, and no parking for each house. So while car ownership levels in the ward are not especially high, car ownership levels in this neighborhood, very high. This pink line here was in the key, as we're not sure whether this current 2-way road should maybe be 1-way. And as a result of some of this consultation back and forth, what went into the design was, yes, it probably should. Actually, we understand some of this desperation about parking and we can make more of it there. But we actually maintained some of the modal filters, added more than were here from the 1980s, in part because some of the younger people said, this neighborhood is completely overwhelmed by cars. We'd like to be able to rollerblade. We'd like to be able to do something that doesn't feel intimidated by cars. Some of the details, where should crossings go? What kind of speed reduction measures might be useful here? That's some of what we came from this consultation. One of the things that was incredibly important to me was the reliability of the data that we get back. And it's really because of these sort of 4 things across the top. It's the agreement or disagreement, of course, that I understand people's point of view and experience, that the detail of their observation is so strong. And there's a strength of feeling. And I understand that as a facilitator, that things are not mild. That's official reliability. I can write that up and I can give here examples of what we learned and how we used it. The unofficial reliability is fascinating. We trusted the people who came to focus groups. We felt we understood what they had to say. I hope they trusted us too. But when I get 100 survey responses back, I've got 2 big reliability problems. I've got 75% of the people who responded to this question thought it was a good idea. 75% of what was my possible ever sample and population? Who does this represent? All I know is who responded to that question. And I said earlier about having time to engage. Often people respond to consultation because they feel strongly about something. They're really in favor of it or they're really against it. Sometimes when they write how much putting in a low traffic neighborhood will destroy their way of life, we're not 100% sure that we trust, that they know what that means, that they don't have a different agenda, some other things. This unofficial reliability about trusting who we were getting information for and from was extraordinary. There were definitely design changes, and I think I've mentioned some of those, from just taking out whole streets. If people said, no, that one's fine, fine, there's a limited amount of funding, that one's out. We really, really confirmed which issues were important to people and how they affected people. And there were some really specific things. People were, they let us know that people who were speeding, say, that was not accidental getting some speed up going downhill, that was deliberate. So we knew in our designs that we would have to have some robust engineering going in because it was an intention, not an accident. Incredibly helpful to those designs. Those brief lessons learned, highly reliable data, really easy to interpret, detailed, fine-grained. I think within the sessions, there was a real sense of listening back and forth. One of the things I've put in our, did we learn this or not? How would we do this in the future is, afterwards, do people just disappear and they don't have any confirmation that we really understood what was going on. Some of the challenges to, are you sure about the parking? I didn't get quite right. Different ages, different perspectives. We're interested in different perspectives. And I was missing some voices. Of all the outreach there was, I was missing women's voices. I was missing older people's voices. And I could tell that especially later when I got survey responses back and I could see differences between men's and women's opinions, that I hadn't been talking as much as I would like to women in the focus groups. And probably the big overall question, will they come back again? Their input was invaluable. Was it worth the time to them? And I don't know. I hope so. That's everything from me. And thank you so much. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I love that point about the value of their time, and how actually for some of these groups that we don't hear from enough, time is actually the most valuable commodity that they have. And sometimes we try to engage them in a way that's convenient for us, not recognizing how valuable that trade is from their perspective. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so moving on to our last presentation from Lucy Bush and Gary Palmer. Lucy Bush is a research director at Britain Thinks, and she grounds her practice in qualitative and ethnographic research, specialising in citizen engagement and deliberative methodologies. She has a passion for place-based research, having run community engagement projects with a range of different clients in public and private sector, exploring sensitive issues and thorny social challenges to inform strategy and policy. And I certainly think that reallocation of road space would fulfil that definition of thorny. And Gary is the lead commissioner for strategy and policy within the Transport and Highways for Warwickshire County Council, and he's worked on various transport and highways roles over 15 years in traffic management, parking, road safety and transport planning. And he's currently overseeing the development of Warwickshire's next local transport plan, talking about a deliberative consultation approach to enable residents to inform the development of LTP4. Gary and Lucy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Mark, and really fascinating presentation so far. Delighted to be here. So Gary and I are going to be talking about a project, as Mark has just introduced, a deliberative consultation approach to community engagement. We're looking at the development of LTP4. So we're going to be co-presenting today. Just a couple of words on Britain Thinks. I'm sure that a lot of people on the call won't have heard of us. We're an insight and strategy consultancy, and we work across these 4 strands, delivering primary research, qual and quant research to deliver insight. We work with our clients to provide strategic counsel. We do a lot of communication work, campaign development, and also we help our clients to understand, get closer to their audiences and build relationships with the audiences that matter most to them. And I think it's fair to say that the project we're going to be talking about today sort of touches on all four of those strands to a degree. We work across different sectors. As Mark said, I lead our place-based research at Britain Thinks, which means that I have the pleasure of working with lots of local authorities and other kind of local organisations, of which Warwickshire County Council is one. You can see them on the screen just there. So our presentation this evening is a presentation of 3 parts. I'm going to hand over to Gary shortly to sort of set out the challenge, and I'm going to talk through the sort of an overview of the approach that we took to that challenge, and then I'm going to talk through sort of 5 ways. We've boiled it down to 5 ways that we feel that this approach of deliberative consultation sort of added value to thinking in the council. And then I'm going to hand back over to Gary to talk through next steps for the LTP. So Gary, over to you.
Thanks, Lucy. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can.
Yeah, so as Lucy mentioned, we obviously, as is the case with most highway authorities in the country, we've had various local transport plans in Warwickshire over the years. We came to the conclusion a little while ago now that our current local transport plan is no longer going to do what we want it to do in terms of delivering highway infrastructure and interventions in the county. So we decided that we wanted to refresh it, and this is the first time that we've refreshed our local transport plan since the central government guidance for how a local transport plan should be put together has been withdrawn. So it presents for us an opportunity to do something slightly differently, and most importantly, align the next LTP to fit with our current priorities as an organisation. So the first thing that we did was we actually consulted commissioned WSP to help us draw up some key themes under which we think that the next local transport plan can be drafted and then achieve the things that we want it to achieve. And you can see those at the bottom of your slide now: the environment, the economy, place, and well-being. And essentially, what we wanted to know, rather than the sort of more traditional approach of writing an LTP and then carrying out a formal consultation and asking people to tell us whether they agreed with it or what they found holes in, we wanted to formally consult at this early stage and see if we're going along the right lines, and have a better chance of taking that feedback and using it to actually make changes and inform the final LTP once we get to that point. So essentially, we wanted to know whether people agreed with us, whether we were doing the right thing. And we did carry out a more traditional survey-based consultation in COVID times, so without the usual road shows that we would have done in the past, speaking to people who would probably have, as Elizabeth has mentioned, have had strong opinions one way or the other about LTP. And that's good, but we are aware of the possibility, as there always is with this sort of consultation, for our respondees to be a self-selecting group. And so we decided that what we wanted to do was to try and complement that approach with the Citizens Panel project that we're talking to you about today. So if we move on to the next slide, Lucy. So we wanted the Citizens Panel to provide some context alongside the more traditional survey-based approach. And so we commissioned Britain Thinks to recruit for us a Citizens Panel to be representative of the people of Warwickshire and the people who use transport in Warwickshire, both in terms of various demographic metrics, but also in terms of the way that people used transport infrastructure in the county, so we could get viewpoints from people who use different types of transport. We wanted them to be non-experts and people who don't regularly engage with the county council on other subjects, and we wanted them to be able to build up quite an in-depth knowledge of a local transport plan, so that they could come to informed conclusions about what they think that we should be doing with the next version. And essentially, much like the other part of the consultation, we wanted them to validate or challenge the proposed themes that we'd come up with for the next LTP, and we wanted them to give us some feedback on possible trade-offs that we're going to have to come to terms with in the LTP, and give us their opinion on the relative priorities of those themes and some sort of things that we might do within some of those themes when we come to actually start commissioning schemes in the next local transport plan. And one of the key things that we wanted to do is we wanted them to consider this without really ever having a conversation with the Warwickshire County Council officer, because we were also aware of our ability to guide people down certain paths when having a conversation about things that are so important to us as the next local transport plan. So that's what we wanted to get out of it. And then we went through a procurement process and appointed Lucy and Britain Thinks to do that for us. And now Lucy will tell you all about how that went.
I will indeed. Yes, thanks, Gary. Yeah, so what you can see on the slide just now is a sort of an overview of the methodology that we designed. I could talk about this for more than a few minutes, but I'll just do a sort of a quick overview to take you through the sort of the process. You can see that it's structured across 4 stages, and that was important because we needed to give our participants the time and space to kind of to learn and reflect and deliberate on the issues that we were putting in front of them. But we started off with a launch event online, and then sort of focus groups where these were participant led. So we were sort of asking people for their spontaneous priorities and understanding what mattered to them without prompting them with anything at that point. But then we moved them on to an online community where we provided information and details on the LTP brought them back into reconvened groups to reflect and debate and discuss the elements of the LTP, and then sort of closing it with a closing plenary event where each of the individual groups could feedback on their kind of recommendations and conclusions. One thing just to sort of underline as well is that was the core approach, very kind of digitally focused in COVID times. We were also very keen to make sure that we had hard to reach. I take your challenge on that term, Elizabeth, but sort of harder to reach residents, people who would otherwise have struggled to engage, perhaps using Zoom or Teams, people on lower incomes, people with caring responsibilities, and they're sort of, we did teledepths with those people and sent out packs in the post to them, so the conversation with those people very much mirrored what was going on in kind of the digital approach. So I'm just going to talk you through 5 ways that we think that this kind of approach added value. And the first, which Gary has already touched on, so I won't sort of labour the point, but I think it's a really important one to start with, which is that the citizens panel was representative of local residents, and it allowed the council to hear new voices and perspectives. And as Gary was saying, through the traditional kind of consultation approach, it's very often that residents with an axe to grind are those who are motivated to share their views. And often, the data that results can be a little bit skewed or represent only that very highly engaged minority. So we, designed a sample frame and had very sort of strict quotas on that sample to make sure that we got a good mix of demographics, people from different walks of life, of course, making sure that people use different forms of transport as well. And in the groups, we mixed people up. So, we were forcing people to listen to other perspectives and other experiences, so people didn't get siloed or just sort of think that that their experience was kind of reflected more broadly. And people really appreciated that, and it really kind of added to the richness of the conversations. And as I've mentioned, we complemented that group kind of discussion approach with those one-on-one interviews to hear from more vulnerable or harder to reach members of the community. So we delivered a sort of a representative sample. Secondly, this approach gave panelists time and space to engage with the detail, and we needed people to do that, to really think about the elements of the LTP and its implications. There's quite a lot of detail and complexity to engage with. So there was certainly a job to do in sort of translating the LTP into public facing materials. But also it wasn't just about sort of getting a knee-jerk response to those elements. I like that, I don't like that. It was about digesting and reflecting and thinking, actually, what does this mean for me in my life? What does this, what impact would this have on me? And then hearing from others who had also gone through that same kind of process of reflection. So we had this digital engagement platform, sort of an online community where in between the kind of the group sessions, participants could engage at their own pace with the detail, and they had time to sort of reflect on the elements of the LTP before we brought them back to discuss that. Thirdly, this approach allowed panelists to say what mattered in their own language. And I think sort of, talking about, the communications research that we do, those kind of learnings and those approaches helped us listen to what panelists were saying. So in those initial groups, I said we sort of had groups that were about capturing spontaneous views and experiences, and participants were talking very much about things that would have an immediate personal benefit to them, reducing congestion, better connected bus networks, safety, cleanliness, affordability, those kind of things. And it was interesting to hear, that's the lens through which they're kind of viewing some of these big challenges. It comes back to kind of their experience and what they see the benefits or drawbacks to them would be. So when we put the themes in front of them, the themes of well-being and environment came out very strongly. They really resonated, in part because they felt so relatable. There was especially with well-being, there was an emotional resonance to that theme, heightened by experiences over the past year and a half. Environment too was seen to have very immediate impacts on kind of quality of life, and so for those reasons, those were the themes that were of particular importance to our panelists. Really interesting, though, was also seeing some of these strategic challenges through a resident lens. And I've drawn on the example of the economy, which was one of the 4 themes, as an example of where participants had a very different framing and take on the economy compared to how it was framed in the LTP. And not to say that they didn't see it as important, they thought that it was very important and could see the links between the economy and other and how transport kind of facilitated or hindered economic growth. But they did find it quite difficult to sort of relate to on a personal level, and often to comprehend the implications. There were phrases like productivity and competitiveness that really people struggle to understand what that meant or what that meant for them personally. Similarly, sort of access to workforce, markets and materials, we sort of got a few confused faces, but that's not to say they weren't talking about those things. They were just using very different language. And so we heard about, getting to school and training, getting to work, supporting local high streets came out from the get-go, encouraging tourism into the county and providing value for money. So all of those, reframing and rephrasing of really key subtopics within the theme of economy was a helpful way to sort of develop thinking about the LTP and how it might be communicated to residents. Fourthly, it shone a light on people's views as users of transport and as citizens. So there's quite an interesting tension here that I think it was useful to kind of to play out in this approach. We talked about sort of the transport vision, and I was just interested in Dan's presentation, seeing the sort of the utopia and dystopias, very similar kind of images that we got back, asking our panelists to send us pictures of what transport is like now and what they would like it to be like in 10 years time. But the feedback we got was that the car was essentially sort of the dominant mode of transport. We did get a mix of different transport users, but it was dominant. And so therefore there was resistance to limiting or disincentivizing driving from that. But when we asked about what problems people had or the complaints that people had, it was the reliance on cars and problems associated with car travel that really emerged as sort of common causes of concern. And overlaying that was concern about climate change and the recognition that car usage has an impact on that. So we got to sort of quite an interesting place with this sort of, yes, people who use cars all the time are also telling us that they sort of support a shift towards greener forms of transport. And it struck us that, in a standard consultation or looking at kind of survey data, it would seem potentially contradictory, a little bit strange. It would be kind of hard to sort of understand what the takeout is and what you can kind of do with that data. What our approach was able to do was sort of get through the impasse a little bit, by sort of just understanding that people were talking to us as users of transport, car drivers, but also people that live in the area and want cleaner air and so on, rather than as strategists. And they sort of, I think they rather threw down the gauntlet in the sense that they sort of said, we want something cleaner, we want something greener. We're not car lovers, we're not sort of wed to the car, but we do need to get to where we want to go to on time. And sort of over to you guys to kind of work out how to square that circle. But I think it just sort of shows that it makes it a much more dynamic and sort of constructive conversation rather than something that ends in just sort of stasis and head scratching. And then finally, just to sort of end on a warm fuzzy feeling point, which is that the panel created a real sense of community and meaningful engagement for our panelists. It was something that people, they recognised others around the table, the virtual table that is, and really enjoyed taking part, and enjoyed meeting others from around the county and in their communities. And I've just got a very short video which I'll play, which is just some clips from our participants telling us what they thought about taking part. So.
Found being part of the panel engaging and interesting.
I've really enjoyed being part of the panel because I've learned quite a lot about all the different aspects of the strategy and how they link together, and I find that really interesting.
It has been enlightening. It's been fun. I learned a lot. The scheme was that everybody on the panels and the staff and everybody was really helpful.
There are a wide variety of people in it from all over the county, all different ages, all different roles in society, or all different jobs, and it's a really good mix.
I think this is a perfect platform to engage everybody, to let people know what's actually happening, and to get people's opinions.
And it was heartwarming in many ways to see that across ages and different types of people, for want of a better way of putting it, we are all interested in this.
And it was just great to have a way of putting some of our inputs into something as a policy that hopefully the local government would be implementing.
It makes me feel that it is not just a plan that is being worked out by a group of people, but they're actually looking for active participation from people who live, people who work, and people who care about the county. I feel lucky to have been chosen to contribute to it.
I'll just pause there, and I'm going to hand over to Gary just to say some final words on next steps for the LTP.
Thanks, Lucy. Yep. So I mentioned before that obviously this process is quite early in our local transport plan project. So the next stage for us is to get approval from our decision makers to go ahead and draft the LTP itself. The responses from the citizens panel and from the survey that we carried out did reasonably closely tally with each other, in that people were in favour of the proposal to draft the LTP along the lines of the 4 themes that we've suggested. So that I now need to present that to our political decision makers and get approval that we'll go ahead and actually write some documents in that vein. And one of the things that we're doing at the moment is actually further engaging the citizens panel to deliver their findings, their message directly to our elected representatives, rather than simply hearing a report from me. They still have to do that because of the standard consultation that we did, but this gives them another voice directed to them without being interpreted by an officer, to help them reach their conclusions about whether they are happy for us to proceed along those lines. That decision is due to be made in September of this year, and then we will get on with actually writing some documents. And what we haven't bottomed it out yet, but we're keen, if we can, to continue to involve the citizens panel with the process of actually writing the LTP itself and giving us more feedback as it develops into something a bit more substantial, and potentially with some more concrete and perhaps controversial content in there that people may have stronger feelings about agreeing or disagreeing with. So that's sort of our next stage, and this is all with a view then to adopting a new local transport plan next year. So yeah, watch this space, but it's certainly provided a perspective that I haven't seen from other consultations that we've done on a similar scale, and we were very impressed with how it's gone so far, and keen to see how it develops over the rest of the life of this project and possibly others in Warwickshire as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much, Lucy. If I can ask you to stop sharing, and we'll join for the panel debate. We've got about 40 minutes or so, if we want to finish about 7:30. So lots of time for questions and discussion. There's been a fair number that have come in on the chat. The first one actually was from Brendan, and the question is worded as this: how do you strike a balance between the best quality public participant that cultivates good sustainable transport infrastructure versus political capitulation to NIMBYism, which is often a minority opinion? So I guess I think my take on that question is, how do you engage getting in views from different minority groups and giving them weight within the decision-making process that doesn't then turn into what people might characterise as NIMBYism? Dan, do you have any views on that? And I'm perhaps thinking of your 3.5% here, because the 3.5% is a powerful, if you're interested in something, you think, I need to get 3.5%, that's brilliant. But then, of course, that could be the tyranny of the minority, couldn't it, in somebody else's language? So, yeah, perhaps any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, a minority is not a good way of choosing what you're going to do. So I'm interested in understanding why people hold their views, and how we can provide tools that allow them to really get to the bottom of why those views are so deeply held. And then what's the way in which we can provide learning material so everybody is on the same page in terms of the opportunities and challenges. And I think, we quite often sort of think that everything that everybody says is right because we're engaging with people. And it may well be, there may be some elements of truth in what they're saying, in what people are saying, and we have to engage with those elements of truth. But at the end of the day, I also sort of have a feeling that we have to get to the point where we are moving forward as a community. So how do you move from the 3.5% to the 25% to the majority? And then how do you move beyond being sort of stuck with the people whose heads are in the sand? And I guess that's a challenging thing. So I wonder what other people think.
Absolutely. I think the key about education and or at least information sharing is absolutely key in that debate.
I mean, just to say, education is about drawing out of. So ex duco is to draw out of someone rather than push into them. And one of the big challenges with education in general is this idea that it's a sort of uneven relationship. So I think it's much more interesting to get people having these sort of peer-to-peer conversations that were sort of described in Lucy's presentation. I think getting those, but having the right subjects for people to talk about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. It was something I noted in your presentation, Elizabeth, was about trust and reliability, and actually the fact that cut it both ways. So there was the fact that participants didn't always trust the practitioner, but actually the practitioner he took a dive on that one. That's not his real view. He's doing that because he's got a different agenda. And that issue of building trust across both ways, I thought was something that was key and difficult.
And I think one of the things that's important in that is naming some of the things we can and can't do. You're not promising that whatever you say will have an impact, that there are wider issues at play, that the decisions, that this consultation is not the one thing that is going to decide a decision. And I think one of the others is probably continuing to ask questions, continuing to, if somebody has a strong, what feels a bit like a stuck opinion or a stuck experience, keep exploring with them. Does that happen every day? Is it always the same? Do all of your neighbors have that? Which neighbors don't have that? As you say, it's the drawing out.
Yes, and I think that comes back to what might come to a question that we'll come to in a bit, which is about time and resources for this agenda, both in terms of actual time and resources, and also in the context of climate emergency and other bits. Lucy, Gary, any thoughts on this issue of how you balance between hearing minority voices without necessarily giving undue weight to minority opinion?
Yeah, I think the first thing that came to my mind was the idea of setting up a constructive and safe space for dialogue. I think that a lot of people will react with anger and sort of feel like they're backed into a corner and sort of, I don't like this and I don't want this thing to happen, if they feel they're being asked by in that way, or that they sort of have to sort of shout to get their voice heard. And I think, Gary, you were kind of making the point that that actually not having council officers ask the questions of our participants took the heat out of the conversation a little bit, and perhaps you can speak to that a little bit. But just this idea that actually you're giving people a space. It's their time to talk and tell us tell us what they think, and actually those initial kind of more hardline opinions soften, and when they kind of listen to other people and have time to kind of reflect and sort of deliberate and debate, and you get to a very different place with that type of approach, and how the questions are asked. I don't know if, Gary, you want to come in on any of that.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as officers, our sort of default position when having conversations with members of the public who are interested in something that we're doing is usually involves sitting in a village or a town hall and having quite a confrontational conversation with a group of people who have, as we've said, very strong opinions about what you're doing. And it's very difficult to avoid the mindset of being quite defensive about what you're doing and having to justify almost pre-made decisions. We were able to observe the panelists' conversations without taking part in them, and it was fascinating to observe how different the tone was in that conversation compared to what we're more used to experiencing as a conversation with our residents, and how much more relaxed and nuanced the conversation was. But the ability of people, when facilitated expertly as it was, to evolve an opinion that often matched an opinion that we would draw as officers working in the profession, probably in a way that we wouldn't have been able to draw out of them if we'd been having a conversation with them ourselves, because of the generally confrontational way that these things happen. So it's that's what we hoped to get out of it, and it really did deliver on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, just comes to a point that's just come up in the chat. Jumping you ahead in the queue here, Graham, but was about a scheme that Graham had been working on using a citizen panel, but has not decided necessarily to be taken forward to be used in the decision-making process. So yeah, you could see, and I think there are various different forms of this deliberative democracy, from panels to assemblies to juries, and actually in some cases you could see that they could take the sting out of some of these decisions, particularly when these decisions are falling on a very small number of elected members, for example. But there is some resistance, I think, to doing that, and I can see why, actually, having been in that space. But I just wondered what your reflection is on this. I mean, Lucy, you've been involved in a few of these, I think, haven't you? What sort of works well, what works less well, and how would you sell this to an elected member, basically saying, I'm sorry, but we're going to ask you to lose some of your power here? How would you sell that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a hard sell, isn't it? I think that the value that this type of approach brings, that stakeholders can see, is that it's non-political. The outputs are non-political. People are engaging as residents, as citizens. They're not engaging with a sort of with a certain ideological hat on or anything, or they vote for certain parties, but that's not how they're sort of responding in the moment. And I think that their voices are it's so helpful to kind of cut through those kind of discussions and that kind of debate. It's sort of it's a different perspective, it's a fresh perspective on kind of potentially quite entrenched sort of positions within a political organization. But having said that, it's constructive. It's not sort of, we wouldn't just sort of let our participants say, no, I don't like that, no, I don't want that. We would always kind of work with them to develop a more constructive position, and I think that can only be valuable. And I think that adds value to decision making along the way. So
I think decision makers are aware that they don't necessarily hear the full picture from respondents to a survey that we put out there. So this, I think, the way I have sold it to our decision makers is that this is just adding to the picture that we see. So it's more relevant information and opinions that in certain circumstances could give decision makers confidence to make a decision that they wouldn't have in a consultation that had been hijacked by a particular pressure group, for example, to give the worst possible type of example of a consultation. So it doesn't remove their power. They're still the ones who are going to make the decision, but it potentially removes some of the constraints that decision makers might feel when they're put in what must be quite an uncomfortable position at times.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So it's a sort of an added level of nuance and granularity to public opinion. And I mean, we've had just a comment here from Andy, I think, Andrew, talking about the DFT's very often repeated point about cutting through the noise and not listening to the loudest voices and having the ability to do that. One issue with that, and I mean, I've seen this play out in some London boroughs who have perhaps been a little bit at the coalface of this issue over the last few months, is around how do you triangulate all of these different inputs into decision making. So Elizabeth, you kind of picked up on this a little bit. So you've got a focus group with some incredibly rich qualitative data. Then you've got a survey, you know, maybe you've done a citizens panel as well at some point, and you know, maybe there's a poll somewhere. And if all four of those things say different things, that can be a very difficult position for a practitioner to be in, and actually can potentially is judicially reviewable and all that sort of stuff. So I mean, what insights and reflections do you have on how does a practitioner triangulate all of this stuff?
Well, they are mixed ideas and methods and approaches. One of the big things for me is coming back to the reliability, to how strongly I can, how strong I think a point is. And I think I do have a bit of a hierarchy about that. And some of the formal research hierarchies of, you know, it's a double blind, you know, like medical research, we're never going to be involved in. That's not the sort of information that we're going to have. And so some of my hierarchy of what's reliable has more to do with some of the qualitative aspects. What's the lived experience of the person who's bringing a point across? Some of the lived experience of the people I was talking to was that driving was incredibly important to them. It was the thing that allowed them to structure their day and do all the things they needed to do. And, you know, we know that there's going to have to be change. But where they are at the moment, that was incredibly important to them. And so anything that makes a change in their area has to address that lived experience as a top of the hierarchy of what's reliability. And I think that's one of the reasons for looking for the edges, because sometimes the majority opinion that comes across leaves off a significant minority, and some of the minority is a requirement. You know, I have to have dropped curbs in order to push a pushchair along. So we can't lose those edges, and some of the reliability is in that edges. Did that make sense as a full circle?
Absolutely did. And I mean, the Transport Planning Society are running our Transport Planning Day campaign this year on the theme of equality, diversity and inclusion. And indeed, this is one of the run-up events to that Transport Planning Day on the 15th of November. Got my plug in. And one of the key things that we've said is that equality, diversity and inclusion in this setting is about who we are as an industry. It's about who we engage with, that's you lot, and this piece, but it's also about how we hardwire that stuff into our technical standards. I mean, we shouldn't have to consult seldom heard or hard to reach people to know that we need tactile paving and you know, level surfaces and all that sort of stuff. So there's definitely an element of making sure we can manage all of that. There was a question here about pace from Robin, I think, if I can get my notes up. Yeah, from Robin, about 2 years too short a timeline to embrace the dramatic future mobility developments we'll be experiencing. And he made a comment about the fact we'll be in flying cars in a couple of years' time. I'm not sure whether that will play out, but in terms of the pace and the amount of time we put into bringing people along with us, that is a big concern. And I think people who have been agitating for some of the changes we've seen on the road network in particular over the last year were really pleased to see stuff finally happening. After many, many years of nothing happening, suddenly all this stuff was happening in some places, and they were very excited about that. But then they've seen the pendulum swing back against that. So clearly that was too fast. But then on the other time, you might have 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, I worked on a cycle scheme in West London that started about 12 years ago, and it's only just recently been implemented in in a temporary form. So that's too long. So there must be a sweet spot here. I mean, Dan, I just wonder, like the tools that you've been talking about in Our Future Towns, I mean, I wonder if they can help supercharge this stuff, because if we could roll that out across the whole of the country and that approach and have some of those automated tools to engage with people about, would that help us move at a quicker pace than we would be able to otherwise, maybe?
That's our hope. I think that, you know, there are many aspects to coming up with plans for the future, and the tools that we use to engage with each other and to engage with the world around us are fundamental. But the other side of the coin, in terms of the citizens' assemblies and the way in which you put in place participatory democracy, is another part. And the third part, I think, is actually engaging with the power structures within communities and trying to work out why the power structures in the community can't be part of the same conversational tools and methods, and you know, rather than just being sort of standing aside and saying, I don't like that, I do like that, which is what we're hearing is happening all over the place, that they're actually part of the process. You know, how are they learning, and how are they listening? How are we listening to them? How are we developing a shared agenda to take the community forward? I think that's quite important, not to lose sight of the fact that they you know, we may or may not agree with all politicians, but they, you know, they were voted in. So I think we have to get them on the table as well, and they have to be part of this, but maybe they don't want to be.
I think in my experience they do, but this issue of being a referee is such a difficult one for them, and it's like you know, what we're doing here with some of these new tools is giving them VAR, aren't we? We're trying to give them a bit more insight. I'm really stretching this one now. Help me, Gary.
A bit better than that, hopefully.
What I mean, in terms of this issue of pace, I mean, you've clearly, there's some sort of timeline associated with LTP4, but you felt it was important to stop at this very early stage and spend what was presumably some months doing this exercise. You know, how did you sell that to decision makers? Was it this idea of the granularity, or the fact that actually it might help sell some of the projects that come down the line if we've got a really strong grounding in some of the strategic objectives?
The latter, I think.
Yeah.
It wasn't a hard sell. It was all of our decision makers were quite on board with this bottom up, is the phrase, isn't it, approach to developing this particular strategy. And I think the attraction for that is that hopefully if you can get buy-in and deliver a scheme that is backed by, you know, at least a reasonable number of people who use the transport system in Warwickshire, then it must give you a head start in what are still going to be some difficult conversations about actually looking to implement some of the schemes that will come out of LTP4 once it's adopted. But the pace of change is going to have to increase. It's given some of the national targets that we've been set in terms of transport and carbon emissions in particular. The pace of change is going to have to be pretty breakneck compared to what we've been used to. So anything that's going to aid those difficult decisions when the time comes to make them is quite easy to sell to a decision maker, I think. But yeah, I say that in the full knowledge that our most difficult decisions are still in front of us. Yes, I think so. And you know, it is the sobering fact that transport is the only industry that's increased its carbon emissions since 1990. Okay, there's a couple of detailed questions about focus group management here, perhaps particularly to Lucy and to Elizabeth. There was a question here around whether you mix people from different groups and different viewpoints, or whether you keep them together. The suggestion being, if you keep them together, they'll feel safer and they'll be more able to voice what they're saying, whereas if they feel like they're a minority, they wouldn't speak out. Lucy, in particular, you made that point that you had mixed them. What was your experience of that? What worked well, what didn't?
Yeah, so this is a particular feature of a deliberative approach. So so in contrast to what Elizabeth did, and I'm sure she can speak to this in a moment, you know, a homogenous group is important. You get people of a similar lived experience or demographic for all of those reasons. But with a deliberative approach, it's part of the process is to get people to engage with other perspectives, other experiences, people with other values, and to get to a kind of a citizen mindset. So the idea is that you take people through a journey across the whole process. You engage them initially as individuals. We ask them about their experiences, and we ask them what they think and to tell us what how they travel, or what they like about travel and transport, etc. And then we move them through, we provide information to them, we facilitate conversations with other people from different walks of life and so on. We can provide, case studies or pen portraits as well to flesh out the conversation. And what we do is we move people into a citizen mindset where they are thinking a little picture. They're sort of thinking about the county as a whole. They're thinking about people with different needs and different experiences. They're sort of charged with the responsibility of coming up with a set of recommendations and conclusions, and they take that very seriously. They take that on board, and it's not just about what I need and what I want. It's actually much bigger picture. So it's a really integral part of a kind of a deliberative process that we mix people up. That's not to say that we don't come up against the challenges of making sure it's a safe space, and making sure that everyone has their voice heard, and that's really up to the design and the moderator to come in and help facilitate those conversations in a particular way. But of course, and I can hand over to Elizabeth, I'm sure she's got stuff to say about homogenous groups. That in other work we do with focus groups, that's a key design principle, that you would kind of bring people together who are similar, and you get a whole different conversation, equally valuable, but in a completely different way when you're having that kind of session.
And I guess I feel kind of middle ground about this, because I talking very nicely about focus groups. I really like the way those come together in the conversations. I've never been a pure researcher. I've always been in the realm of needing to get a thing done and modifying your methods for what's actually happening on the ground. And for me, some of the thing about focus groups and what people have in common and don't have in common, if you gave yourself 5 labels, you might have 3 in common with the next square along and 2 in common with the next square the other direction. And I don't know which of those I would ask you to bring to a focus group. What when we say the things you have in common, I'm often talking about to people who have in common the experience of a smaller area. In this case, I was talking about a neighborhood in particular. And some, but they definitely come with different perspectives. Some are parents of children with disability and they come into the neighborhood to use a service there, and some live there all the time. Those are very different perspectives. So I am asking the sorts of questions that are step back and tell me what you think is true for the majority of the people who use this neighborhood. Tell me what might be different for you and different from each other, and we highlight some of the differences. And then there's framing. There is just naming what's happening in the group and what's happening in those differences, because I am looking for differences that emerge also.
Excellent, thank you very much. And there was another question about how you find focus group people, and also for people for the panel. Did you pay them? How did you come up with the people to film these? Yeah, go on, Lizzie.
So we work with essentially professional market research recruiters. We have people based in communities all across the UK, so we have pretty decent coverage, and we supply them with kind of a screener questionnaire, so we can keep close tabs on demographic quotas and other attitudinal quotas that we want to screen for, and they use a range of different kind of methods for finding people. They typically have kind of a database that they've kind of sort of put together over the years as a starting point, but they will snowball from that to find the people that we need. And we usually put as a standard screening question a requirement that they haven't taken part in any research for kind of a 12-month period. So we're not getting people that are kind of, repeat participants, which can be a problem. We do pay them. So thank you for their time. And I think that just is really important to the point we've been sort of speaking to earlier about making sure that we get people who aren't motivated to be there because they have a particular axe to grind, or any particular passion or interest in something. We want to just get access mainstream kind of points of view, and make sure that people aren't out of pocket for attending. So we always would incentivize participation.
Elizabeth, is that your experience as well?
It really, the work is quite variable, and Lucy's talking about a longer term commitment, I think, from people in terms of the things they need to learn and think about and engage with, and I would absolutely follow that guidance. For a single one-off, I've completely gone for begging people to attend, but also the snowball approach of going through all the groups that are listed locally, all of the religious organizations, volunteer centers, community, and also where those exist, and I'm lucky to have them, absolutely work with professional, not necessarily professional marketing recruiters, because that's not it just wouldn't work with what it is I happen to be doing and the timescales I happen to be working with, but professional organizations that already have big networks definitely work alongside them and will happily pay them to recruit people to focus groups.
That's an interesting way of doing it. So you're rewarding them as almost a finder's fee, really, for providing that view. Yeah, excellent. Okay, coming to the end now. I just wondered if there was any reflections on the current status of the skill and expertise that is in the industry to do this stuff. I mean, transport planners are a varied bunch, and we do bring a lot of skills to this debate, but consultation and engagement in particular, and behaviour change to a certain extent we've been talking about here today, is quite specialist. And I wonder, particularly because we've got people here, not so much you, Gary, but other people from outside the industry, what your reflection is on the sort of skill and the status of the industry, and what we might need to do a bit better or a bit differently to achieve success here. Dan, any reflections from you on that, your experience on Future Towns?
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, I don't like the framing of it just being about transport. I think the idea of it about placemaking and transport planning together, I think is really important. The other is, I think that we have to move away from, and I typed it in, that, when we work with people, it's about I and now, to talking to people about, we're doing this project about our future town, our future, and we're thinking about the well-being of the community as a whole, and that's the focus. That's what we're interested in. We're interested in the future, because actually we're not planning for today. We're planning for this huge future, that's stretching out. And if we'd have started this conversation with people 30 years ago and talked about our future and talked about the needs of the next generation or the well-being of the community as a whole, I think we'd be in a different place now. And so I think that this idea of the community as a voice, a sounding board for today, is wrong. And what we need to engage with is the creativity of the community when they think about their future together. I know it's a bit of a polemic, but those are the things I'm interested in.
I like that. But we need to become better ancestors, I think, is the phrase that sometimes
that's a bad objective, but it doesn't necessarily need to be turned into a sort of, it doesn't have to be that. It can just be, say, let's think about the well-being of your community in the future.
Yeah, no, I like that. And Lucy, perhaps your perspective on this, and whether you sort of got insight from some of the work you do in other sectors that might be relevant here. I mean, are there other sectors, perhaps completely unrelated, that do this pretty well?
Yeah, you put me on the spot there. I have to have a
I
think
have.
about
I'm
that.
sorry about that.
No, that's fine. But I was just going to sort of say that, yeah, I would agree with what Dan was saying. And I don't know that I can speak for the sector as a whole, but what I do think is that there's definitely an opportunity here, and to think broader than transport. I mean, even, you know, other local issues like planning that are beset with, you know, yeah, issues like NIMBYism, or kind of where the debate can kind of can get very stuck on a particular issue. I think that what this kind of citizen engagement can do is to just, yeah, find new ways forward, which is incredibly important. And it does, as we've kind of discussed, require a degree of bravery and boldness, and kind of for decision makers to kind of to embrace that way of doing things. In terms of other kind of sectors and other clients that do this, I mean, I do a lot of deliberative work as a form of consultation with different organisations, local authorities, certainly. I mean, other kind of corporates are often, when they're sort of trying to develop kind of a thought leadership piece on something, will do a kind of a consultation kind of a style approach, which is a sort of another form of that, and certainly kind of public sector, sort of national government clients as well. Yeah, thinking about kind of new ways to do something, but we'll take this type of approach. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I think we've got our pounds of flesh out of you tonight. Much appreciated for your time and for your expertise. And it's clearly an agenda which is not going away, and an area where we have to do renewed focus on. I think it is good to see so many people engaged in this debate. I mean, transport planning, always a topic that people were happy to engage with me at parties. Didn't often end pleasantly for either party, really, but even more so now. In fact, I tend to keep stum now about my profession, but which is itself an interesting sign. Really great to see the level of engagement coming around this agenda, and it is going to be a critical challenge over the next 10 years, and there's a real onus on us to move quickly and to get this stuff going quickly, because every gram of CO2 that goes up into the atmosphere is even more difficult to remove after it goes up. So thank you very much. I'll bring the event to a close. The next Transport Planning Evening Lecture is on the 9th of September, and that is our bursary prize. Our bursary presentation evening. So all of our young transport planning professionals will be presenting their bursary topics. We provide a bursary paper, a bursary prize for people who wish to enrol with us, with a winning sum of £500 for the best bursary prize. And this year's theme was all on equality, diversity and inclusion. So very much up at the same line as our Transport Planning Day campaign. So yeah, look forward to seeing you all on the 9th of September, and have a good evening. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Shania, can you let us know when we're no longer live, please? Or Brogan?
Sorry, I can't. I can only leave for some reason. Oh, it's because Shania's the host.
I can end the meeting. I can
yeah,
end the
thanks,
webinar.
Shania.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys. Take care.
That's great. All right. Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Thanks all.